In the autumn of 1876, deep in the Chiricahua Mountains of Arizona Territory, a white cavalry scout named Daniel Mercer stood before an Apache war council, surrounded, disarmed, and certain he would die. But the matriarch who ruled that mountain stronghold had other plans. She rose from her seat of honor, walked through 500 mounted warriors waiting in the canyon below, and spoke 6 words that would change both their peoples forever. "I want you to father my warriors." This is the story of how a man condemned to execution became the bridge between 2 worlds, and how the woman who spared him rebuilt her nation from the ashes of war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert sun had bleached the bones white. Daniel Mercer knelt in the dust of Fort Bowie's parade ground, hands bound behind his back, watching. The commandant paced before him like a man searching for words adequate to his rage. 3 junior officers stood witness, their faces carved from stone and judgment. Behind them, the flag snapped in the dry wind, the only sound besides boot heels on hard-pack earth. Colonel Raymond Thatcher finally stopped. "You let them escape." Daniel said nothing. The ropes bit into his wrists. 23 hostiles, Thatcher continued, his voice tight and cold. "Women, children, old men, doesn't matter. They were Apache. Your orders were to guide Lieutenant Harrison's detail to their camp and ensure none scattered into the mountains. Instead, you led that detail 3 miles in the wrong direction while the whole band vanished like smoke." Daniel met the colonel's eyes. They weren't hostiles. They were farmers trying to stay alive on a patch of ground that wouldn't feed a rattlesnake. Thatcher's jaw flexed. "That's not your determination to make, Mercer. You're a scout. You follow orders." "I follow my conscience first." The backhand came fast, splitting Daniel's lip. Blood pooled warm against his teeth. He spat into the dirt and straightened, refusing to bow. "You're 28 years old," Thatcher said quietly, "and you've thrown away a promising career for a band of savages who'd gut you without a second thought." He turned to the officers. "Strip him of rank, discharge him dishonorably, and see that every fort and trading post from here to California knows Daniel Mercer is a traitor to his uniform." The words fell like stones into a grave. By sunset, Daniel stood outside the fort gates with nothing but the clothes on his back, a canteen, and the boots he'd walked in. No horse, no rifle, no coin. The desert stretched before him in shades of copper and shadow, beautiful and merciless. He walked south. 3 days later, thirst had begun to carve him hollow. His tongue thickened, his vision blurred at the edges, and the sun hammered down like divine punishment. He stumbled through arroyos, lined with creosote and ocotillo, following a dry riverbed that promised water somewhere beyond the next ridge. Vultures circled overhead, patient as prophecy. On the 4th morning, he collapsed beneath an overhang of rock, too weak to continue. His canteen had been empty since noon the day before. He closed his eyes and let the world drift into silence. When he woke, a shadow stood over him. Daniel blinked, trying to focus. The figure resolved into a young Apache woman, maybe 20, with dark eyes that held no fear and no pity. She wore a deerskin dress, her hair bound with red cloth, and in her hand she carried a water skin. She knelt, uncorked it, and held it to his cracked lips. He drank greedily, coughing, then forced himself to slow. When he could speak, his voice came out hoarse. "Thank you." She studied him with the calm appraisal of someone deciding whether to waste effort on a dying thing. Then she stood and gestured for him to follow. Daniel struggled to his feet, legs shaking, and stumbled after her. The trail wound upward through narrow passes and hidden switchbacks, paths no white man would ever find without guidance. After an hour of climbing, the canyon opened into a broad valley, ringed by sheer cliffs. And there, spread across the valley floor like something out of legend, was an Apache stronghold, dozens of wickiups clustered around cookfires, horses grazing in corrals, and children playing near a spring that poured cold and clear from the rock face. But what stopped Daniel cold were the riders. 500 of them, maybe more, arrayed in loose formation across the valley's southern end. Warriors on horseback, armed with rifles, lances, and bows, silent as shadows. They watched him approach with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open hostility. The young woman led him past the riders, through the camp, and toward the largest wickiup, a structure set apart, its entrance flanked by 2 older men who carried themselves like generals. She stopped at the threshold and spoke in rapid Apache. One of the men nodded and disappeared inside. A moment later, a voice called out low, clear, and edged with authority. The woman gestured for Daniel to enter. He ducked through the opening and straightened slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. The wickiup was larger than it appeared from outside, its framework hung with hides and woven blankets. In the center, a small fire crackled, its smoke rising through the smoke hole above. And seated across from the fire, wrapped in a blanket dyed deep red, was a woman. She was perhaps 50, her face lined by sun and sorrow, her black hair streaked with silver and bound in a single braid that fell past her shoulder. Her eyes were dark and sharp, the kind that missed nothing. She studied Daniel with the calm intensity of someone reading a man's entire history in the dust on his boots. "Sit," she said in accented but clear English. Daniel lowered himself carefully to the ground across from her, his body still weak, his mind racing. She waited until he was settled, then spoke again. "You are Daniel Mercer, the white scout who let my sister's family escape the soldier camp 3 weeks ago." His throat tightened. "Yes. They told me you walked into the desert alone, discharged. Cast out." She tilted her head slightly. "Why did you do it?" Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because they weren't soldiers. They were people trying to survive. I couldn't lead men to slaughter them." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "You gave up everything for strangers." "I gave up my uniform," Daniel said quietly. "Not my soul." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. "My name is Kaya. I am the leader of this band. My husband was killed by your people 2 years ago. My eldest son died in the same raid. My daughter's husband fell at the Canyon of the Dead last spring." She paused, letting the weight of those losses settle between them. "We are few now. The war has taken too many, and the reservation your government offers is a slow death, disease, starvation, and the loss of everything we are." Daniel said nothing, sensing she wasn't finished. Kaya's eyes hardened. "I have 3 daughters of fighting age, strong women, brave. But the warriors we have left are not enough to protect our people. The young men are too few. The bloodlines are thinning. If we are to survive, we need new strength." Daniel's pulse quickened, unsure where this was leading. Kaya rose slowly, moving with the grace of someone who had commanded respect her entire life. She stepped around the fire and stood before him, looking down with an expression that was part challenge, part calculation. "You saved my sister's family. You chose honor over your own people's approval. You have no home now, no tribe, no place among the whites." She paused, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. "But you could have one here." Daniel stared up at her, his mind struggling to grasp what she was suggesting. Kaya's next words came slow and deliberate, each one measured like the beating of a war drum. "I want you to father my warriors." The fire crackled. Outside, the sound of 500 riders shifting in their saddles drifted through the stillness. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. "What?" "My eldest daughter is unwed," Kaya continued, her tone matter of fact. "She is strong, intelligent, and skilled in healing and strategy. You will marry her." You will teach our young men the tactics of the white soldiers, how they think, how they move, how they can be defeated. And you will give us children, strong children, born of two worlds, who will lead our people when I am gone." Daniel felt the ground tilt beneath him. "You're asking me to—" "I am not asking," Kaya interrupted, her voice sharpening. "I am offering you a choice. You can leave this camp tomorrow and die in the desert, or you can stay, become one of us, and help us survive what is coming." She leaned closer, her eyes boring into his. "But understand this, Daniel Mercer, if you stay, you are no longer white, you are Apache. Your loyalty will be to us, your children will be raised as warriors of this band. And if you ever betray us, those 500 riders outside will hunt you to the edge of the earth." The weight of her words pressed down like stones. Daniel swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He thought of the fort, the discharge, the desert he'd barely survived. He thought of the family he'd saved and the look of gratitude in their eyes as they disappeared into the mountains. And he thought of the woman standing before him, strong, ruthless, and desperate enough to stake her people's future on a white man with nothing left to lose. Kaya straightened and walked back to her seat across the fire. "You have until sunrise to decide. If you accept, my daughter will be brought to you. If you refuse, you will be given water and sent away." She gestured toward the entrance. Daniel rose slowly, his legs unsteady, and stepped out into the fading light. The 500 riders still waited in the valley below, motionless and silent, their eyes tracking his every move. And somewhere in the camp, a woman he had never met was waiting to learn if a disgraced scout would become her husband and the father of a new generation of warriors. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel spent the night beneath a lean-to at the edge of camp, staring at stars that seemed closer here than anywhere he'd ever been. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of horses stamping and the low murmur of voices from the cook fires. His mind turned over Kaya's proposition like a man examining a coin with two unfamiliar faces, both valuable, both dangerous. By the time dawn broke pale and gold over the mountain peaks, he had made his choice. He found Kaya standing near the spring, her blanket drawn against the morning cold, speaking quietly with two of the older warriors. When she saw him approach, she dismissed them with a slight gesture and turned to face him fully. Daniel stopped 3 paces away and met her eyes. "I'll stay." Kaya studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "You understand what this means?" "I think so," Daniel said. "But I expect you'll teach me the rest." A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth, barely there, but enough. "Come." She led him through the camp, past wickiups where women tended morning fires, and children peeked out with wide, curious eyes. The warriors who had filled the valley the night before had dispersed to their duties, some tending horses, others sharpening weapons or repairing gear. A few watched Daniel pass with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility, but none spoke. Kaya brought him to a smaller wickiup, set slightly apart from the others, its entrance facing east to catch the first light. She stopped outside and called softly in Apache. A moment later, the hide flap lifted, and a woman stepped out. She was perhaps 25, tall and lean, with black hair that fell loose past her shoulders and eyes, the color of dark honey. She wore a deerskin dress decorated with turquoise beads, and around her neck hung a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. Her face was angular and striking, marked by the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. She looked at Daniel without shyness or hesitation, appraising him the way a horse trader might examine unfamiliar stock. Kaya spoke in Apache, her tone formal but warm. The woman listened, nodded, then replied in a voice low and steady. Kaya turned to Daniel. "This is my eldest daughter, Naira. She has agreed to this union." She paused, then added, "She speaks English, learned from the missionaries before we left the reservation. She will be your teacher in our ways, and you will be hers in the ways of the white soldiers." Naira's gaze remained fixed on Daniel, weighing him with the precision of someone who had learned to read men quickly and accurately. "You are the one who saved my aunt's family." "Yes," Daniel said. "Why?" He hesitated, then answered simply, "Because it was right." Naira tilted her head slightly, considering. "Right for who?" "For them. For me. Maybe for no one else." She absorbed this, then asked, "Do you know how to track?" "Some." "Do you know how to survive without fire?" "Not well." "Do you know how to read the wind?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Naira's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then you will learn, or you will die. Either way, you will not be useless." Kaya spoke again in Apache, her tone carrying the weight of ceremony. Naira nodded and gestured for Daniel to follow her. They walked in silence toward the far side of the valley, where a narrow trail climbed into the rocks. Naira moved with the easy confidence of someone who had walked these paths her entire life, her footsteps soundless on stone. Daniel followed, aware that every warrior they passed was watching, measuring, judging. After 20 minutes of climbing, the trail opened onto a flat outcropping overlooking the entire valley. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the camp below. Smoke from cook fires rose in thin columns, and the sound of children laughing drifted up faint and clear. Naira sat cross-legged on the rock and gestured for Daniel to do the same. For a time, neither spoke. The wind moved through the canyon, carrying the scent of pine and dust. Finally, Naira said, "My mother told you about my father." Daniel nodded. "She said he was killed 2 years ago. He was riding ahead of our column when the soldiers ambushed us near the San Pedro River. They shot him from cover, then rode over his body to reach the rest of us." Her voice remained steady, but her hands tightened slightly in her lap. "My brother tried to protect the children. They shot him too. He was 16. Daniel said nothing, understanding that silence was the only honest response. Naira continued, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "My mother has kept us alive since then. She is the strongest person I have ever known. But she is right. We are too few now. If we stay as we are, we will be hunted down or forced onto the reservation, where we will die slowly of sickness and shame." She turned to look at him directly. "That is why you are here. Not because we love the white man, not because we forgive, but because we need what you can give us." "Children," Daniel said quietly. "Warriors," Naira corrected. "Children who will be raised to fight, to lead, to survive. My mother believes that mixing our blood with yours will make them stronger, able to think like white soldiers but move like Apache. She believes this is our only chance." Daniel met her eyes. "And what do you believe?" Naira was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I believe my mother has never been wrong about survival. And I believe you walked into the desert alone rather than betray people you didn't know. That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "That you might be worth the risk." She stood and began walking back down the trail. Daniel rose and followed, his mind turning over her words. When they reached the valley floor, Naira led him to a different part of the camp, a cluster of wickiups where several older women sat working hides and weaving baskets. They looked up as Naira approached, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. Naira spoke to them in Apache, and one of the women, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, laughed and said something that made the others smile. Naira replied, her tone dry, and the woman laughed. Again. She turned to Daniel. "They say you look too thin to father anything but rabbits. I told them you would learn to eat properly." Daniel couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at his mouth. "I'll do my best." The older woman rose and approached him, studying his face with the intensity of a field surgeon examining a wound. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing at his shoulders, his hands, his stance. Naira translated. She says you have good bones but bad posture. She wants to know if you can ride. Yes. Can you shoot? Yes. Can you run 10 miles without stopping? Daniel hesitated. Not anymore. The woman snorted and said something sharp. The others laughed. Naira's expression remained neutral. She says you will learn, or you will embarrass me. She suggests the latter is more likely. The woman patted Daniel's shoulder once hard enough to make him step back, then returned to her work, still chuckling. Naira led him away, toward the corrals where the horses were kept. That was my grandmother. She does not approve of this arrangement, but she will not oppose my mother. Does anyone else oppose it? Half the camp, Naira said bluntly. They think you will betray us, or that you are too weak to be useful, or that mixing our blood with yours will weaken our children. She glanced at him. You will have to prove them wrong. They reached the corrals, and Naira pointed to a roan gelding with a white blaze on its face. That one is yours now. His name is Chato. It means flat nose. He is not beautiful, but he is strong and will not throw you when the shooting starts. Daniel studied the horse, compact, sturdy, with intelligent eyes. Thank you. Naira handed him a rope halter. You will need to earn his trust. He does not like strangers. Daniel approached the horse slowly, speaking in low tones. Chato's ears flicked forward, and after a moment he allowed Daniel to loop the halter over his head. Naira watched without comment, then said, Come. There is more you need to see. She led him to the far end of the camp, where a group of young men, boys, really, none older than 15, were practicing with lances and bows under the watchful eye of a scarred warrior. They moved with impressive precision, but Daniel could see the gaps in their training movements that would leave them vulnerable in close combat, stances that sacrificed balance for reach. Naira followed his gaze. These are the boys who will become warriors. Most have lost fathers or brothers. They learn what they can from the men who remain, but it is not enough. She looked at him. You will teach them how white soldiers fight, how they think, how they can be beaten. Daniel nodded slowly. When do I start? Tomorrow. Today, you rest and eat. Tonight, there will be a ceremony. What kind of ceremony? Naira's expression was unreadable. The kind that makes you Apache. The sun had dipped below the western ridge by the time the camp gathered around the central fire. Daniel stood near the edge of the circle, acutely aware that he was the focus of every eye. The warriors sat in groups according to age and rank, their faces impassive. The women clustered together, whispering behind their hands. The children stared openly, fascinated. Kaya sat at the head of the circle, wrapped in her red blanket, flanked by the two older warriors who seemed to serve as her counsel. Naira stood beside her mother, her face calm but watchful. Kaya rose and spoke in Apache, her voice carrying across the gathering. Daniel didn't understand the words, but he caught the cadence, formal, ritualistic, weighted with significance. The crowd listened in absolute silence. When Kaya finished, one of the older warriors stood and walked to Daniel. He carried a clay bowl filled with red paint and a brush made from horsehair. The warrior spoke, his voice rough and serious. Naira translated quietly from beside him. He says, you must choose. Walk away now, and you will be given supplies and safe passage. Stay, and you will be marked as one of us. There is no going back. Daniel looked at the bowl, then at Kaya, then at Naira. He knelt. The warrior dipped the brush in paint and drew a line across Daniel's forehead, then down each cheek. He spoke again, and Naira translated. You are no longer white. You are no longer the man you were. You are born again into this band, and your old name dies with your old life. The warrior stepped back, and Kaya rose again. She walked to Daniel and placed both hands on his shoulders, her grip firm. From this day, she said in English, you are called Ashki Nat Ani. It means warrior who leads the young. You will live among us, fight with us, and die with us if that is what the spirits demand. Do you accept this?" Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of the fort, the uniform he'd once worn, the life he'd left in the dust. Then he thought of the family he'd saved, the woman standing beside her mother, and the 500 riders who had waited in silence to see what he would choose. "I accept." Kaya nodded once, then spoke again in Apache. The crowd murmured, some in approval, some in skepticism, but none in outright rejection. The ceremony continued with singing and drumming, the rhythm building until it seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. Food was brought out, roasted meat, corn cakes, and a bitter tea that burned going down. Daniel ate what he was given, aware that he was being watched, tested, measured against some invisible standard. When the fire had burned low and the children had been carried off to bed, Naira approached him. "Come." She led him to the wickiup, where she lived, a modest structure, clean and carefully kept. Inside, a small fire crackled, and blankets were spread across the floor. Naira turned to face him, her expression serious. "We are married now, by the customs of my people. But I will not ask you to share my bed until you have proven yourself worthy of—" Daniel nodded, relieved and grateful. "That's fair." She pointed to a corner of the wickiup where a separate blanket had been laid. "You will sleep there. At dawn, you will rise with me. You will learn our ways, our language, our skills. And when the time comes, you will teach our young men how to stay alive against an enemy that outnumbers us, 50 to 1. Daniel met her eyes. "I'll do everything I can." Naira studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "My mother believes you are the answer. I do not yet know if she is right, but I will give you the chance to prove it." She turned away and lay down on her blanket, facing the wall. Daniel moved to his corner and stretched out on the hard ground, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the camp settled into the rhythms of night, low voices, the stamp of horses, the distant cry of an owl. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the smoke hole above and the stars visible beyond. He thought about the path that had brought him here, the discharge, the desert, the choice that had seemed impossible just days ago. And he thought about the woman lying across the fire from him, a stranger he was now bound to for life. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled low and mournful, a sound that carried across the mountains like a warning or a welcome. Daniel closed his eyes and let sleep take him. When he woke at dawn, Naira was already gone, and the smell of coffee drifted through the camp like a promise that today would bring new trials, new tests, and the slow, uncertain work of becoming someone he had never imagined he could be. The morning cold bit through Daniel's borrowed shirt as he stood in the training ground, facing 15 Apache boys who stared at him with expressions ranging from open curiosity to barely concealed contempt. The oldest couldn't have been more than 16. The youngest looked about 11, a wiry kid with a scar across his chin and eyes that burned with premature rage. Behind them, a dozen warriors had gathered to watch, arms crossed, faces skeptical. Among them stood a man Daniel would soon learn to fear and respect in equal measure, Goyakla, a warrior in his early 30s, with a face like carved granite and a reputation for having killed more soldiers than any man in 3 territories. He leaned against the corral fence, watching Daniel with the patient attention of a hunter studying prey. Naira stood off to the side, translating when needed, her expression neutral but her presence somehow reassuring. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm not here to make you fight like white soldiers. I'm here to teach you how to beat them," Naira translated. A few of the boys shifted, interested despite themselves. The scarred 11-year-old spat in the dirt and said something sharp in Apache. Several boys laughed. Naira's face didn't change, but her voice carried an edge. "He says white men talk before they die. He wants to know if you can do anything else." Daniel studied the boy, saw the pain behind the bravado, the loss that fueled the anger. What's his name? Takoda. It means friend to everyone, though he has not earned it. Daniel nodded slowly, then walked to the boy and knelt so they were eye level. You lost someone. Takoda's jaw tightened. Father? Brother? The boy's hands clenched into fists. Daniel spoke quietly, aware the others were listening. The men who killed them, they followed patterns. Patterns you can learn to predict. Patterns that will keep you alive, long enough to make them pay. He paused. I can teach you those patterns. Or you can spit in the dirt and die like the rest. Takoda stared at him, hate and hunger warring in his eyes. Then he nodded once, sharp and quick. Daniel stood and addressed the group. White soldiers fight in formations, lines, columns, squares. They rely on discipline and firepower. They're taught to stand and shoot, reload together, advance together. That makes them predictable. He drew a diagram in the dirt, with a stick, simple lines representing cavalry formations. When they charge, they stay tight. That's their strength. But it's also their weakness. A tight formation can't react fast to scattered targets, can't adjust when the ground shifts, can't see what's coming from the sides. One of the older boys spoke up, his English halting but clear. We already know this. Do you? Daniel looked at him. Then show me. The boy hesitated, then stepped forward. His name was Niol, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd already proven himself in small skirmishes. Daniel handed him a stick. You're a cavalry unit. 10 men. You're pursuing a group of Apache through a canyon. How do you move? Niol drew a line in the dirt, straight and direct. Daniel nodded. Now, where are you vulnerable? The sides. The rear. And where does your commander focus his attention? Niol paused, thinking. Forward. On the enemy. Exactly. Daniel drew 2 more lines, flanking the first. So, you hit him here and here, never from the front where he expects you. You split into 3 groups. 2 pin him from the sides, force him to divide his attention. The 3rd circles behind and strikes when he's committed to the flanks. By the time he realizes the real threat is behind him, half his men are already down. The boys leaned forward, studying the diagram. Goyakla pushed off the fence and walked closer, his expression unreadable. Daniel continued, but timing is everything. If you hit too early, he retreats and regroups. Too late, and he's already through the canyon. You need coordination without signals. That means knowing your brothers well enough to move as one mind. He looked at the boys. That's what we'll work on. Not just tactics. Trust. Niol studied the diagram, then looked up. You have done this. This tactic. I've seen it done, and I've seen it fail when the timing was wrong. Daniel met his eyes. I've also seen it work perfectly. The difference was practice. Goyakla spoke for the first time, his voice deep and measured. Naira translated. He says talk is cheap. He wants to see if you can move like Apache or only think like white man. Daniel turned to face him. How would you like me to prove it? Goyakla smiled a thin, dangerous expression. He said something in rapid Apache that made several warriors laugh. Naira's translation came flat. He says you will race him to the top of the ridge and back. If you win, the boys will listen to you. If you lose, you can go back to talking and leave the real training to real warriors. Daniel looked at the ridge, a steep climb, maybe a mile of broken terrain through rock and brush. He'd been half-starved a week ago and still hadn't fully recovered his strength. He nodded. When do we start? Now. Goyakla broke into a run without warning, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to this land. Daniel took off after him, his legs screaming protest within the first 100 yards. The terrain was brutal, loose shale that slid underfoot, thorny brush that tore at exposed skin, and a gradient that burned the lungs like fire. Goyakla moved like water over stone, never hesitating, never slowing. Daniel followed with grim determination, focusing on breath and footwork, ignoring the pain that spread through his calves and thighs. Halfway up, his vision started to blur at the edges. His lungs felt like they were pulling in sand instead of air. Goyakla glanced back once, saw Daniel still coming, and pushed harder. Daniel dug deeper than he thought possible, drawing on reserves he'd built during long cavalry patrols and forced marches. He wouldn't win, that much was clear, but he'd be damned if he'd quit. When they crested the ridge, Goyakla was 30 yards ahead. He turned and waited, barely winded, while Daniel staggered the final distance and bent over, hands on knees, gasping. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Goyakla said something in Apache, short and grudging. Naira's voice drifted up from below, where she'd climbed halfway to watch. He says, "You run like a wounded deer, but you did not stop." Daniel straightened, still breathing hard, and met Goyakla's eyes. "Teach me to run like Apache, and next time I'll make you work harder." Goyakla studied him, then did something unexpected. He laughed. A real laugh, deep and genuine. He clapped Daniel on the shoulder, hard enough to make him stumble, then turned and started back down the ridge at a pace that was somehow even faster than the ascent. Daniel followed, his legs trembling but his spirit oddly lifted. When they reached the bottom, the boys were waiting in silence. Goyakla said something to them in Apache, his tone serious. Then he turned to Daniel and spoke in broken English. "You are slow, but you do not quit. That is something." He paused. "I will watch your teaching. If it is good, I will say so. If it is weak, I will say that too." Daniel nodded. "Fair enough." Goyakla walked away, and the tension in the air shifted, not gone, but eased. Takoda, the scarred boy, stepped forward. "Show us the flanking tactic again." Daniel smiled faintly and reached for the stick. The days fell into rhythm. Dawn brought training with the boys' tactics, terrain reading, understanding cavalry movements and weaknesses. Daniel taught them to think like soldiers, so they could outthink soldiers. He showed them how to predict patrol routes, how to use terrain to negate superior firepower, how to turn the enemy's discipline against him. But more importantly, he learned from them. Naira taught him to track not just the obvious signs white scouts looked for, but the subtle ones. A bent grass blade that told direction. A stone turned over revealing damp earth beneath. The way birds reacted to human presence long before eyes could see movement. An old warrior named Ashki, no relation to Daniel's new name, taught him to move silently, to place each foot with intention, to read the wind and use it to mask sound and scent. The first time Daniel managed to approach a deer within 20 yards without spooking it, Ashki nodded once in approval. It was the closest thing to praise Daniel had received from any of the older warriors. Naira's grandmother, whose name was Desba, taught him which plants could be eaten, which healed, and which killed. She did this while insulting his intelligence in rapid Apache, which Naira translated with barely concealed amusement. She says you are lucky to have survived to manhood, given that you cannot tell food from poison. Tell her I'm a quick learner. Desba snorted and said something sharp. She says the rabbits are quick learners too, but they still end up in the stew pot. Despite the barbs, Desba made sure Daniel ate properly, pressing extra portions on him at meals, checking that his boots were in good repair, and once, when she thought no one was watching, mending a tear in his shirt with careful, precise stitches. The children were easier. They had no memory of white kindness to complicate their judgments, so they treated Daniel with the simple directness of the young. They challenged him to races he always lost, taught him Apache words with exaggerated patience, and laughed when he mispronounced them. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, appointed herself his language tutor. Her name was Ayana, and she had enormous dark eyes and the attention span of a hummingbird. She would grab his hand and drag him around camp, pointing at objects and making him repeat the Apache words until he got them right. "Shash," she would say, pointing at a bear hide. "Shash," Daniel would repeat. She would shake her head dramatically. "No, shash. That's what I said. No, listen. Shash, shash. Better." Then she would dart off to find the next object, her laughter trailing behind her like music. The warriors remained divided. Some, like Goyakla, watched with cautious respect. Others made their contempt clear through cold stares and deliberate distance. A warrior named Kuruk, broad-shouldered and mean-eyed, went out of his way to make Daniel's life difficult. He would arrive late to training sessions and interrupt with loud skepticism. He challenged Daniel's tactics in front of the boys, questioned his courage, and made crude jokes at his expense. Once, he accidentally released Daniel's horse from the corral, forcing him to spend half a day tracking Chato through the mountains. Naira noticed but said nothing, watching to see how Daniel would handle it. The confrontation came 3 weeks into his time with the band. Daniel was working with the boys on knife work, teaching them how soldiers fought in close quarters, where to strike for maximum effect, and how to defend against bayonet thrusts. Kuruk sauntered over, arms crossed, and said something in Apache that made several warriors laugh. Naira's translation came quiet. "He says you teach like a woman, all words, no blood." Daniel kept his focus on the boys. "Tell him he's welcome to join us if he wants to learn something useful." Kuruk's expression darkened. He spoke again, louder this time. "He says he has nothing to learn from a man who ran away from his own people and now hides behind Apache women." The training ground went still. Every eye turned to Daniel. He set down the practice knife slowly and turned to face Kuruk. "You have something to say to me. Say it in a language I understand." Kuruk's English was rough but clear. "I say you are a coward. You betray your people because you are weak. Now you pretend to be Apache, but you are still white, still weak." Daniel kept his voice level. "If you want to test that, I'm right here." Kuruk smiled, cold and eager. He pulled a knife from his belt, a long blade with a worn leather grip, and tossed it to Daniel. Then he drew his own. Goyakla appeared at the edge of the training ground, watching with sharp interest. Kaya emerged from her wickiup, her face grave. Naira stepped forward as if to intervene, but her mother caught her arm and shook her head slightly. This needed to happen. Kuruk moved first, a testing strike that Daniel deflected with the flat of his blade. They circled each other, boots scraping in the dust. Kuruk feinted left, then drove forward with speed that caught Daniel off guard. The blade sliced across his forearm shallow, but enough to draw blood. The boys gasped. Kuruk laughed. "First blood, you want to quit?" Daniel shifted his grip, ignoring the burn in his arm. "Not even close." They engaged again, faster now. Kuruk fought with raw aggression, all power and fury. Daniel fought with precision, learned from years of close-quarters combat training. He blocked, parried, and waited for the opening he knew would come. It came when Kuruk overextended on a downward slash, committing too much weight forward. Daniel sidestepped, hooked Kuruk's wrist with his free hand, and used the man's momentum to drive him face-first into the dirt. Before Kuruk could recover, Daniel's knee was on his back, and the knife was pressed against his throat, not cutting, just present. "Yield," Daniel said quietly. Kuruk struggled for a moment, then went still. Daniel stood and offered his hand. Kuruk stared at it, pride and anger warring on his face. Then, slowly, he reached up and let Daniel pull him to his feet. For a long moment they stood face to face. Then Kuruk said something in Apache, grudging but without hostility. "Goyakla," translated. "He says you fight better than you run." Daniel nodded. "Tell him he's fast. If he'd been more patient, I'd be the one in the dirt." When Naira translated this, Kuruk's expression shifted surprise, then something close to respect. He nodded once, then walked away. The boys crowded around Daniel, chattering excitedly. Takoda was grinning the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from him. Kaya approached. her face unreadable. She studied Daniel's bleeding arm, then spoke in Apache. Naira translated. "My mother says you handled that well. Kuruk will not trouble you again. He respects strength, and you showed him yours without humiliating him further than necessary." Daniel pressed his sleeve against the cut. "I didn't want to fight him." "No," Kaya said in English, "but you did anyway. That is what matters." She turned and walked back to her wickiup, and Daniel understood that he had passed some invisible test. That evening, as Naira cleaned and bound his arm by the fire, she said quietly, "You could have killed him. That wouldn't have helped anything. No, but many men would have done it anyway. To make a point." She tied off the bandage and met his eyes. "You are learning." "Learning what?" "That strength is not always about winning. Sometimes it is about choosing not to destroy your enemy when you have the chance." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and in that moment, something shifted between them, small but real. Later, as they lay in their separate blankets with the fire burning low, Naira spoke into the darkness. "Takoda's father was killed protecting the children during a raid. His mother died of fever last winter. He has no one." Daniel said nothing, understanding she was telling him something important. "He needs someone to be angry at. You were convenient." She paused. "But today, you gave him something better than anger." "What's that?" "Hope that maybe he can survive this, that maybe there is a way to fight back that does not end in death." The fire crackled softly between them. Daniel stared at the smoke hole above, at the stars visible beyond, and felt the weight of what he'd taken on, not just a wife, not just a role, but the future of children who had lost everything and were looking to him for answers he wasn't sure he had. Somewhere in the camp, a drum began to beat, slow and steady like a heartbeat, and Daniel closed his eyes, letting the rhythm pull him down into sleep. 6 weeks into his new life, Daniel rode beside Kaya at the head of a delegation moving south through the mountain passes. 30 warriors accompanied them, including Goyakla, Kuruk, and 2 of the older boys from training Niol and Takoda. Naira rode close to Daniel's left, her face composed but alert. They were heading to Cañón del Oso, a neutral meeting ground where various Apache bands gathered twice yearly to trade, share information, and settle disputes. Kaya had explained it simply. "We need allies. Other bands need to know we are still strong, and they need to see that you are real." The journey took 2 days through terrain that shifted from pine forest to red rock canyons. At night, they camped without fires, eating dried meat and speaking in low voices. Daniel noticed the way the warriors positioned themselves, always with sightlines to high ground, always with escape routes planned. It was tactical thinking, so ingrained it had become instinct. On the morning of the 3rd day, they crested a rise and looked down into a broad canyon where dozens of wickiups dotted the valley floor. Smoke rose from cook fires, and Daniel counted at least 300 people, maybe more. Horses filled makeshift corrals, and clusters of warriors stood in conversation throughout the camp. Kaya raised her hand, and the group halted. She turned to address them in Apache, her voice carrying authority. When she finished, she looked at Daniel and switched to English. "There are 4 bands here besides ours. Some are friendly. Some are waiting to see if we are worth their time. Some believe we have grown weak." Her eyes held his. "What happens in the next few hours will determine whether we stand alone or stand with allies. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Be yourself. Answer honestly when questioned, and stay close to Naira." They descended into the canyon. Eyes followed them from every direction, curious, suspicious, calculating. Daniel felt the weight of scrutiny like physical pressure. He kept his posture relaxed but alert, his hands visible and away from weapons. A group of warriors approached to greet Kaya, men in their 40s and 50s, marked by scars and the bearing of those who had survived decades of warfare. They spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing occasionally toward Daniel. Their tones ranged from respectful to openly skeptical. Kaya responded with calm authority, and after several minutes of conversation, the warriors nodded and stepped aside. Naira leaned close to Daniel. That was Cochillo, leader of the Mescalero band. He asked why you were here. My mother told him you were her daughter's husband and a teacher of tactics. He said he would reserve judgment. Fair enough. They moved deeper into the camp, and Kaya led them to a large central area where leaders from each band sat in council. A fire burned in the center, and around it sat 5 individuals who commanded immediate respect. 3 men and 2 women, all aged by sun and hardship, all watching with eyes that missed nothing. Kaya took her place among them. The warriors spread out in a loose semicircle behind their respective leaders. Daniel found himself standing between Goyakla and Naira, acutely aware that he was the only white face in a gathering of Apache power. The council began with formalities, greetings, acknowledgements of shared blood and common enemies. Daniel didn't understand the words, but he recognized the rhythm of diplomacy. Then one of the other leaders, a woman with silver hair braided with red cord, spoke directly to Kaya. Her tone was sharp, challenging. Naira whispered the translation. That is Desba of the Chiricahua band, no relation to my grandmother. She is asking why Kaya brought a white man to sacred ground. She says it is an insult to the ancestors. Kaya's response came measured but firm. Daniel caught his Apache name, Ashki, Na Ta'ane, and saw several council members lean forward with interest. Another leader, a lean man with a face like weathered leather, spoke up. His questions came rapid fire, and Kaya answered each one without hesitation. Naira continued translating. That is Nantan. He wants to know if you are a spy. My mother is telling them about the family you saved, about your discharge, about the ceremony that made you Apache. Nantan's eyes shifted to Daniel, assessing. He said something brief. He wants you to speak for yourself, Naira said. He asks why you would betray your own people. Daniel felt every eye turn to him. He took a breath and spoke clearly, knowing Naira would translate. I didn't betray them. I refused to murder farmers because a colonel wanted to count scalps. There's a difference, Naira translated. Several warriors nodded slightly. Desba spoke again, her voice dripping with scorn. She says words are easy. She wants to know what use you are to Kaya's band besides. Warming her daughter's bed, Daniel kept his expression neutral despite the heat rising in his chest. I teach the young warriors how cavalry units move, how they think, how they can be beaten. I've helped them understand that white soldiers are predictable, they follow doctrine, and doctrine has weaknesses. As Naira translated, he saw interest in several faces. Cochillo, the Mescalero leader who'd greeted them earlier, leaned forward and asked a question. He wants an example, Naira said. Daniel nodded. Last spring, a cavalry patrol from Fort Grant followed a raiding party into the Dragoon Mountains. The patrol expected to chase scattered warriors. Instead, they rode into a canyon where the warriors had split into 3 groups, 2 on the flanks, 1 behind. The cavalry realized too late they'd been herded into a kill zone. They lost 17 men before they retreated. He paused. That tactic works because cavalry commanders are trained to pursue directly. They think in terms of frontal engagement. If you understand that, you can manipulate their movements like chess pieces. Cochillo spoke again, nodding slowly. Naira's translation carried a hint of approval. He says, "This is good thinking." He asks if you have other examples. For the next 20 minutes, Daniel laid out tactical scenarios, ways to use terrain against cavalry charges, how to predict patrol routes based on fort locations, methods for disrupting supply lines without direct confrontation. He spoke with the authority of someone who had lived on both sides of this war, and gradually, the skepticism in the circle began to shift. But Desba wasn't finished. She rose to her feet and addressed the council with passion, gesturing toward Daniel. Her words came hot and fast. Naira's voice tightened. She says tactics mean nothing if the man teaching them has no courage. She says you ran from one fight and now hide behind women. She challenges you to prove you are worthy of the name my mother gave. The council went silent. Kaya's face remained impassive, but Daniel saw the tension in her shoulders. He looked at Desba. What kind of proof does she want? Desba smiled coldly and spoke again. She says if you are truly Apache, you will ride with the warriors on the raid planned for tomorrow. A supply wagon is moving from Fort Thomas to Fort Apache. Weapons, ammunition, medicine. If you fight like Apache and the raid succeeds, she will accept that you belong among us. If you fail, or if you betray the warriors to your former people, she will see that you die slowly. Daniel felt Naira stiffen beside him. Kaya's eyes narrowed dangerously, but before she could speak, Daniel answered, "I'll ride." Goyakla made a sound that might have been approved. Kuruk grinned wolfishly. The council murmured among themselves. Kaya spoke in Apache, her tone hard. Desba replied with equal force. The two women locked eyes for a long moment, then Desba inclined her head slightly acknowledgement, not submission. The council concluded shortly after. As the groups dispersed, Kaya pulled Daniel aside, with Naira following. "You should have let me handle Desba," Kaya said quietly. "She wasn't challenging you. She was challenging me. The raid is dangerous. The supply wagon will have a heavy escort, maybe 30 soldiers. If something goes wrong, then I'll deal with it." Daniel met her eyes. "You brought me here to prove I belong. This is how I do that." Kaya studied him, then sighed. "You are either very brave or very foolish. I have not decided which. Can't it be both?" A faint smile touched her mouth. "Perhaps." That evening, as warriors from various bands gathered around fires to share food and stories, Daniel found himself sitting among a mixed group, some from Kaya's band, some from others. The atmosphere was tense at first, but as the night wore on, and the talk turned to old battles and narrow escapes, the walls began to lower. Goyakla told a story about outwitting a cavalry patrol by circling behind them 3 times, each time stealing something, first a saddle, then a rifle, then the patrol commander's hat. By the time the soldiers realized what was happening, they were so unnerved they retreated without firing a shot. The warriors laughed, and someone else chimed in with a similar tale. A Mescalero warrior named Chaitan turned to Daniel. "You have a story?" Daniel thought for a moment, then said, "I was scouting with a cavalry unit near the Gila River. Young lieutenant, fresh from the east, didn't know the land. He saw dust rising in the distance and assumed it was a war party, ordered a charge before I could warn him it was just wild horses. His unit rode straight into a dry wash. 6 men broke legs when their horses stumbled, and by the time they sorted themselves out, the real Apache scouts had been watching from the ridge for 20 minutes, laughing. The warriors grinned. Chaitan nodded appreciatively. "Your people are brave, but stupid." "Some," Daniel agreed. "Not all. And you? Brave or stupid?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm here, aren't I?" That earned genuine laughter. Later, as the fires burned low, Naira found Daniel sitting alone at the edge of camp, staring out at the dark mountains. She sat beside him without speaking for a while. Finally, she said, "You did well today. Your mother doesn't think so. My mother worries. That is her job." Naira paused. Desba pushed hard because she is afraid. Her band has lost many warriors. She sees us taking in a white man and thinks we have grown desperate. Haven't you? Naira turned to look at him. Desperation and strategy are not the same thing. My mother does not act from weakness. She acts from vision. What vision? That our people can survive this war by adapting, by learning from our enemies without becoming them, by mixing what is best from both worlds. She held his gaze. You are part of that vision. But visions mean nothing if the people do not believe in them. That is why tomorrow matters. Daniel nodded slowly. If I survive tomorrow, what happens? If you survive and fight well, many warriors will ask to train with you. Other bands will listen when Kaya speaks, and Desba will have no choice but to accept you. And if I don't survive? Naira's expression remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes. Then I will mourn a husband I was only beginning to know. The words hung between them, honest, unadorned, and somehow more intimate than any declaration of affection. Daniel reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, fingers intertwined, watching the stars wheel overhead while the camp settled into sleep around them. Dawn came cold and sharp. 15 warriors gathered at the southern edge of camp, a mixed force from 3 different bands. Goyakla led the group, his face painted for war. Kuruk checked his weapons with methodical precision. Neol and Takoda were there, too, the boy having convinced the elders he was ready. Daniel wore Apache clothing, now buckskin shirt, leggings, and moccasins that allowed for silent movement. He carried a Winchester rifle taken from a cavalry raid months ago, a knife at his belt, and a canteen of water. No uniform, no insignia, nothing that marked him as anything but what he'd become. Kaya stood before the group and spoke in Apache, brief, formal, carrying the weight of both blessing and warning. When she finished, she looked at Daniel and switched to English. "Bring my warriors home." "I will." Naira approached and pressed something into his hand, a small leather pouch on a cord. "Medicine bag. For protection." Daniel tied it around his neck. "Thank you." She held his eyes for a moment, then stepped back. The 15 riders moved out as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. They rode hard for 3 hours, following trails that wound through canyons and across high desert plateaus. Goyakla set a punishing pace, and Daniel pushed Chato to keep up, grateful for the weeks of conditioning that had rebuilt his endurance. By mid-morning, they reached a ridge overlooking the supply route. Below, a dirt road cut through open country, exposed, predictable, perfect for ambush. Goyakla signaled a halt and dismounted. The warriors gathered around as he sketched the plan in the dirt. Daniel watched, following the tactical layout even before Neol translated. 3 groups, the boy whispered. 1 blocks the road ahead, 1 hits from the left flank when the wagon stops. The 3rd, our group, circles behind to cut off retreat and take the rear guard. "Classic encirclement," Daniel murmured. "Good plan." They waited in the rocks above the road, motionless as the sun climbed higher. Takoda crouched beside Daniel, his young face tight with anticipation. "Nervous?" Daniel asked quietly. "No." "Liar." Takoda's mouth twitched. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified." The boy looked surprised. "You fought before." "That's why I'm terrified. I know what can go wrong." Before Takoda could respond, Goyakla raised his hand, the signal for silence. Below, dust rose on the southern horizon. The supply wagon appeared 10 minutes later, a heavy freight wagon pulled by 6 mules, surrounded by 20 mounted cavalry troopers. More than expected. Daniel's gut tightened. Goyakla watched them approach, calculating. Then he gave the signal. The first group moved into position on the road ahead, a rock slide, quickly arranged, blocking passage. The wagon driver saw it and reined the mules to a halt. The cavalry lieutenant barked orders, and soldiers moved to investigate. That's when the second group struck from the left, a volley of rifle fire that dropped 3 soldiers before they could react. The lieutenant screamed commands, and the cavalry formed a defensive line. Goyakla's group charged from behind. Daniel urged Chato forward, rifle up, aiming for the soldier positions rather than men. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession. 1 shattered a rifle stock, another hit a horse's saddle, causing it to buck wildly. The 3rd struck the ground near a soldier's feet, forcing him to dive for cover. The warrior beside him gave him a sharp look, questioning why he wasn't killing. More useful, alive and panicked, Daniel shouted over the gunfire. The battle dissolved into chaos. The cavalry tried to form a square but couldn't coordinate in time. Warriors swept through their lines, scattering horses, seizing weapons. The lieutenant drew his saber and charged at Goyakla, who sidestepped with contemptuous ease and brought his lance across the man's chest, unhorsing him without a killing blow. Within 5 minutes, it was over. The surviving soldiers fled north on foot, leaving the wagon, weapons, and horses behind. No Apache had been killed. 2 were wounded, minor injuries. The warriors whooped in victory, already stripping the wagon of its contents. Rifles, ammunition, medicine, blankets, everything of value was quickly distributed among the horses. Goyakla approached Daniel, breathing hard, eyes bright. You did not kill. Didn't need to. Panic is more useful than corpses. Panicked men run back to their fort and tell stories about ghosts who strike like lightning. That fear spreads. That's worth more than 20 dead soldiers. Goyakla considered this, then smiled slowly. You think like Apache now. They rode back to Cañón del Oso with captured supplies and no losses, a victory that would be told around fires for months. When they entered the canyon, warriors from all the bands lined the path, watching in silence. Daniel rode beside Goyakla, covered in dust and sweat, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes measuring him. Kaya stood at the center of camp, flanked by the council leaders. As the raiders dismounted, Desba stepped forward. She walked directly to Daniel and studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke in Apache, formal, clear, carrying across the camp. Naira appeared beside him to translate, her voice quiet with emotion. She says you fought with courage and wisdom. She says the ancestors would recognize you as one of their own. She acknowledges that Kaya's vision was true. Desba extended her hand. Daniel took it. The camp erupted in shouts and drumming. Warriors pressed forward to clap Daniel on the back. Children ran circles around the celebrating adults. The tension that had filled the canyon for 2 days released in a flood of acceptance. Kaya watched it all with satisfaction, then caught Daniel's eye and nodded once pride and vindication combined. That night, the bands feasted together. Stories were told. Alliances were strengthened, and Daniel found himself at the center of attention he neither wanted nor could escape. But later, when the fires burned low and most had gone to sleep, he slipped away to find quiet. Naira found him, as he'd somehow known she would. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching in the darkness. You could have killed many soldiers today, why didn't you? Because dead soldiers make martyrs. Terrified soldiers make better stories, and stories change how future battles are fought. She was quiet for a moment. You are not like other white men. I'm not like anyone. Naira smiled in the darkness. No, you are not. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until dawn, 2 people from different worlds, building something neither had words for, but both could feel growing stronger with each passing day. 4 months passed like water over stone, gradually reshaping everything it touched. The band's camp had grown. 2 families from Cochillo's Mescalero group had joined them, bringing skilled hunters and a woman who knew medicine beyond what even Desba possessed. 3 young warriors from Nantan's band arrived, seeking training, having heard stories of the white man who thought like an Apache and fought like a ghost. Daniel's training ground had expanded from 15 boys to nearly 30, ranging from 10-year-old Ayana's older brother to men in their early 20s who had survived battles but wanted to survive more. The lessons had evolved beyond basic tactics into something deeper, a systematic approach to warfare that combined Apache mobility with strategic thinking borrowed from military academies Daniel had never attended but had learned from officers who had. The results spoke louder than words. In September, a coordinated patrol sweep from Fort Grant had tried to trap the band in their winter camp. Daniel's students had detected the movement 3 days early through careful observation of supply movements and patrol patterns. The band relocated before the soldiers arrived, and the cavalry spent 5 days searching empty canyons while the Apache watched from high ridges, invisible and amused. In October, a raid on a cattle drive netted 40 head of livestock without a single shot fired. The dock drovers woke to find their herd simply gone, moved overnight through terrain they'd thought impassable. The cattle fed the band through the early winter and provided trade goods with allied groups. By November, Kaya's band had become the most sought-after ally in 3 territories. Other leaders sent messengers asking for tactical advice, requesting Daniel train their young men, seeking alliance against the ever-tightening noose of military campaigns. The prosperity showed in tangible ways. Children who'd been thin in summer now had meat on their bones. The elderly received better care, warm blankets, sufficient food, medicine when needed. The wickiups were reinforced against winter cold, with supplies carefully raided from military stores. Horses that had been gaunt now moved sleek and strong through the mountain pastures. Kaya's authority had solidified into something approaching legend. Warriors from distant bands spoke her name with respect. Even army officers at Fort Bowie had begun referring to her group as the Ghost Band, impossible to pin down, striking where least expected, vanishing like morning mist. And at the center of this transformation stood 2 people who had become something neither quite expected. Daniel woke before dawn, as had become his habit. The wickiup was warm despite the December cold outside, kept comfortable by careful fire management, and the thick buffalo hide Naira had traded for with a Comanche group passing through in late autumn. She lay beside him now, her back curved against his chest, his arm draped over her waist. They'd been sleeping this way for 2 months, since the night she'd simply moved her blankets next to his without discussion or ceremony, as if the decision had already been made and only required acknowledgement. He felt her breathing change as consciousness returned. She shifted slightly and her hand found where it rested against her stomach. "You're awake early," she murmured. "Habit. Bad habit. Dawn is still an hour away. Can't help it. Military training runs deep." She turned to face him, their noses nearly touching in the darkness. "You are not a soldier anymore." "No," he agreed. "I'm not sure what I am now." "You are Ashki Nata Ani, warrior who leads the young, husband to Kaya's eldest daughter, father of the next generation, though we are working on that last part." He smiled. They'd been intimate for 6 weeks now, the physical barrier finally falling away one night when she'd looked at him across the fire and said simply, "I am ready. Are you?" The transition had been natural, inevitable, right in ways Daniel couldn't articulate, but felt in his bones. "Your mother asked me yesterday if you were pregnant yet," he said. Naira laughed softly. "Of course she did. She is patient about many things, but not about grandchildren. She already lost 1 daughter to fever and sees each day as borrowed time. She didn't lose you. No. But she worries she will. We all do. In this life." Naira's hand moved to his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "That is why we hold tight to what we have while we have it." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that only comes when 2 people have learned each other's rhythms well enough that words become optional. Finally, Naira said, "Tell me about your family." Daniel tensed slightly. They'd avoided this conversation for months, dancing around personal histories like stepping over cracks in ice. "Why now?" "Because I share your bed and carry your possible children, and I realize I know almost nothing of where you came from." She paused. "You know everything about me, my father's death, my brother's murder, the years on the reservation. I know you were a scout and that you chose honor over duty. But before that, who were you?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to speak, his voice low and halting. "I grew up in Missouri, small town. My father was a blacksmith. Good man. Fair. He died. When I was 14, kicked by a horse he was shoeing. After that, my mother tried to keep the business going, but he trailed off. It was hard. I had a younger sister, Rebecca. She was 10 when Pa died. Where are they now? My mother passed away 3 years ago. Consumption. Rebecca married a shopkeeper in Street Louis. I haven't seen her since I joined the cavalry 5 years ago. Sent letters when I could, but... He shook his head. After the discharge, I don't know if she got word. Don't know if she thinks I'm dead or just gone. Naira's thumb moved gently across his cheek, and he realized his eyes had grown damp. Do you miss them? Every day. But I can't go back. Even if I wanted to, I'm a deserter in their eyes. A traitor. If I showed up in street, Louis, I'd be arrested before I made it to Rebecca's door. So you gave up everything. I gave up the life I thought I'd have, but I found something else. He pulled back slightly to meet her eyes. I found this. You. A purpose that doesn't keep me awake at night with guilt. Naira studied his face in the growing pre-dawn light. You carry heavy things, Daniel Mercer. We all do. Yes. But some of us have people to help carry them. She kissed him gently. You are not alone anymore. The words broke something loose in his chest, a knot of isolation he'd been carrying since the moment he walked out of Fort Bowie's gates. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and let himself feel the weight of belonging. They stayed like that until true dawn broke, light filtering through the smoke hole above, and the camp began to stir with morning sounds. Later that week, during a rare, quiet afternoon when training had been cancelled due to heavy snow, Daniel found himself in Kaya's wiki-up, helping her review supply inventories and plan for spring raids. The work was meticulous, tracking ammunition counts, food stores, horse conditions, and the medical supplies they'd need to acquire before summer campaigns began. Kaya worked with the focused intensity of someone who knew that small oversights could mean dead warriors. Daniel had learned to match her precision, and they'd fallen into an efficient partnership that required few words. After 2 hours, Kaya set down her writing stick and leaned back, studying him with the directness that still occasionally caught him off guard. My daughter is happy. Daniel looked up from the ledger. I'm glad. No. You do not understand. I mean truly happy. Not just content or satisfied. Happy. Kaya's expression softened in a way he rarely saw. I had not seen that in her since before the soldiers killed her father. She carried grief like a stone in her chest. Now, the stone has cracked. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. Kaya continued, When I made the offer 4 months ago, I did it for strategy, for survival. I saw a man with useful skills and no other options. I thought. She paused, choosing words carefully. I thought I was making a bargain, trading my daughter's future for the band's security. I knew she would accept because she understands duty, but I did not expect this. Expect what? That you would love her, that she would love you back, that it would be real. Kaya's eyes held his. You could have simply done your duty, trained the warriors, fathered children, and maintained the arrangement. Many men would have, but you gave her something more precious than strategy. What's that? Hope that life can be more than survival, that there can be joy even in this endless war. Daniel felt the weight of her words, the vulnerability beneath the leader's mask. She saved me too, he said quietly. I was dying in that desert, not just physically, inside. She gave me a reason to keep fighting, a reason to believe that doing the right thing might actually matter. Kaya nodded slowly. My husband used to say that the strongest warriors are not those who never feel fear, but those who find something worth fighting for despite the fear. You have found that? Yes. She reached out and placed her hand over his, a gesture of affection he'd never seen from her before. You are my son now, in every way that matters. When the children come, they will be truly blessed, carrying the blood of 2 peoples, taught by parents who chose each other rather than accepting what fate offered. Her hand squeezed once, firm and warm, then released. Now, she said, returning to business, about those ammunition supplies. Winter deepened, and with it came the kind of intimacy that only emerges when people are forced to spend long, dark hours in close quarters. The band's activities slowed to essential work: hunting, wood gathering, maintaining equipment, telling stories around fires that blazed against the cold. Daniel and Naira spent their evenings teaching Takoda and the other children to read and write, both English and the Spanish they'd need for trading in the southern territories. The boy had become something of a younger brother to both of them, often sleeping near their fire when nightmares of his parents' deaths made his own wiki-up unbearable. One particularly cold night, after Takoda had finally fallen asleep on a blanket near the fire, Naira and Daniel lay together under thick furs, speaking in whispers. "He asked me today if he could call me mother," Naira said softly. "What did you tell him?" "That I would be honored, but that his real mother deserved to be remembered. That he could call me whatever felt right to him." Daniel pulled her closer. "You'll be a good mother when the time comes." She was quiet for a moment. "I think the time is already here." His breath caught. "You're certain?" "Not yet. But I have missed my moon time by 2 weeks. My body feels different. And this morning, I could not stand the smell of cooking meat without feeling sick." Daniel felt something vast and terrifying and wonderful open up inside his chest. A child. Perhaps it is early. Many things can happen. But he could hear the hope in her voice, carefully guarded but present. He shifted so he could see her face in the firelight. "Are you afraid?" "Yes. My mother lost a daughter to childbirth. Many women do. The medicine woman says my hips are wide and strong, but—" She trailed off. "Yes, I am afraid. I'll be there, every moment. Men do not attend births. It is not our way. Then I'll change the way. I'm not leaving you to face that alone." Naira smiled, her eyes shining. "You are very strange, Daniel Mercer." "Ashki nata ani," he corrected gently. "No." She touched his face. "Tonight you are Daniel, the man I chose. Not the warrior, not the teacher. Just the man." They made love slowly, carefully, aware of the precious possibility growing between them. And afterward, as they lay tangled together under the furs, Naira said something she'd never said before. "I love you." The words in Apache were different from English, heavier somehow, carrying more weight. But their meaning was unmistakable. Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. "I love you too, more than I thought possible." She nestled against him. "When the child comes, if the child comes, we will name it after your father if it is a boy. After your sister if it is a girl. You don't have to do that. I want to. You left your family behind. This will bring them back, in a way. Keep their memory alive." He held her tight, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gesture. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, but inside their wickiup, wrapped in furs and each other's warmth, they were untouchable. By late December, Naira's pregnancy was confirmed by the medicine woman. The news spread through the camp like wildfire, and the celebration that followed lasted 2 days. Warriors brought gifts: a carved cradle board, soft rabbit furs for swaddling, protective charms blessed by the oldest healers. Kaya's joy was almost painful to witness. She held Naira's face in her hands and wept the first time Daniel had ever seen her cry. "A grandchild," she whispered. "A future. Thank the ancestors." Even the warriors who'd been most skeptical of Daniel came to offer congratulations. Kuruk brought a beautifully crafted knife, saying gruffly, "For the boy, to learn to fight when he is old enough." "What if it's a girl?" Daniel asked. Kuruk looked surprised. "Then she will need it even more." Goyakla gave Daniel a rare embrace. "You have given Kaya the greatest victory, not against soldiers, but against despair. This child will lead warriors when we are dust. That is immortality." On the solstice, the longest night of the year, the band gathered for the ceremony. Fires burned bright against the darkness, and the drums spoke of continuity and survival. Kaya stood before them all and spoke of the year's victories, of alliances strengthened and enemies thwarted. And then she spoke of the coming child, the first of a new generation that would carry them forward. This child, she said, her voice carrying across the assembly, will be born of two worlds, will carry the strength of Apache warriors and the strategic mind of those who would destroy us, will be living proof that we can adapt without losing who we are. This child is our answer to every soldier who thinks we can be crushed. We endure. We evolve. We survive. The crowd erupted in ululation and drumming. Daniel stood beside Naira, his arm around her still flat belly, and felt the weight of what they'd created, not just a child, but a symbol of hope for people who had every reason to despair. That night, lying together after the celebration, Naira took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "Can you feel it?" she asked. "Not yet. Too early." "I can." A flutter, like butterfly wings, life taking root. Daniel closed his eyes, focusing all his attention on that small point of contact. And perhaps it was imagination, perhaps wishful thinking, but he thought he felt it, the faintest tremor of movement, of possibility, of future. "I never thought I'd have this," he whispered. "A family, a home, a reason to believe tomorrow might be better than today. You have it now." Naira's voice was fierce. "And I will fight with everything I am to keep it, to keep you, to keep this child safe. We'll fight together. Yes, together." They fell asleep like that, his hand on her belly, her hand covering his, two people from impossible circumstances, building something that shouldn't exist, but did and would endure whatever came next. Outside, the winter stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and eternal. And somewhere in the darkness, the future waited uncertain, dangerous, but no longer hopeless. Because hope, Daniel had learned, wasn't about certainty. It was about choosing to believe that the struggle mattered, that love could survive in harsh places, and that children born of two worlds might inherit the strength of both. As he drifted toward sleep, his last conscious thought, he was a prayer to ancestors he didn't know and gods he wasn't sure existed, a prayer of gratitude for second chances, for women who saw worth where others saw betrayal, and for the strange, winding path that had brought him from disgrace to belonging. The prayer had no words, but it didn't need them. The life growing under his hand was answer enough. Spring came early to the Chiricahua Mountains, melting snow into rushing streams and painting the valleys green with new growth. Naira's belly had begun to swell visibly, and the medicine woman predicted birth would come in late summer, when the heat ripened the desert fruit and hawks circled high on thermal winds. Life had settled into rhythms that felt almost peaceful, a dangerous illusion in a land where peace was always temporary. The warning came on a morning in early March. A scout named Nahale rode into camp at dawn, his horse lathered and heaving. He'd been watching the movements around Fort Bowie, tracking supply convoys and patrol patterns as Daniel had taught him. What he reported made Kaya's face turn to stone. Daniel stood in the council gathering, listening as Nahale spoke rapidly in Apache. Goyakla's expression darkened. Kuruk's hand drifted to his knife. Even the usually calm elders shifted uneasily. Naira translated quietly for Daniel's benefit, though he was beginning to understand more Apache than he let on. "A new colonel has taken command at Fort Bowie. His name is Carrington. He has brought 200 fresh cavalry from the east, plus Apache scouts from the San Carlos reservation men who have agreed to hunt their own people for army pay." She paused, her voice tightening. "Nahale says there are posters in every settlement and trading post, wanted posters, for Kaya, for Goyakla, for the leaders of every free band, and—" She stopped. "And what?" Daniel asked. "And for you, by your old name, Daniel Mercer, deserter and traitor. The reward is $500, dead or alive. The dedanos part." Council went silent. Kaya's eyes found Daniel's across the fire. Her expression revealed nothing, but he could see the calculations running behind her gaze, weighing risk, measuring loyalty, considering possibilities. One of the older warriors spoke, his tone sharp and accusatory. Naira didn't translate, but Daniel didn't need her to. He could read the suspicion in the man's posture, hear it in his voice. Goyakla responded harshly, gesturing at Daniel with clear defensiveness. An argument erupted, voices rising, hands moving toward weapons. Kaya stood, and silence fell instantly. She spoke for several minutes, her words measured but forceful. When she finished, she looked at Daniel and switched to English. Some believe this is no coincidence, that your arrival and this new campaign are connected, that perhaps you were never truly discharged, that you were sent to infiltrate us, learn our ways, and lead soldiers to our camp when the time was right. She paused. I do not believe this, but I must ask you directly, before all of us. Are you a spy? Daniel met her eyes steadily. No. If soldiers come, will you fight beside us? Against your former people? Yes. If your old commander offers you pardon in exchange for betraying us, will you refuse? I would die first. Kaya held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. She turned to the council and spoke again in Apache final, authoritative, brooking no argument. The suspicious warrior subsided, but his expression remained hostile. Others looked uncertain. The easy trust Daniel had built over months suddenly felt fragile as spiderweb. Naira touched his arm. Come, we should talk. They walked to the edge of camp, where the morning sun hadn't yet burned off the mist, clinging to the valley floor. Naira's hand rested protectively on her belly, a gesture that had become an unconscious habit. Some will doubt you now, she said quietly. No matter what my mother says. I know. If soldiers come and we must fight, you will need to prove yourself in ways you have not had to before. I understand. She turned to face him fully. Daniel, listen to me. If this Colonel Carrington is as dangerous as Nahale suggests, the coming battle may be the worst we have faced. Many will die, and if, her voice caught, if you are captured, they will hang you. Not just shoot you like a warrior. They will make a spectacle of your execution to discourage other soldiers from choosing conscience over orders. Then I won't be captured. You cannot promise that. He took both her hands in. Listen to me. I chose this life. I chose you. I chose that child growing inside you. Whatever comes, I face it as Apache, not as a white man with regrets, as your husband and the father of your child. Tears glistened in her eyes. I am afraid. So am I. But we face it together. She pressed her forehead against his chest, and he held her while the sun rose higher and the camp behind them prepared for war. The attack came 3 weeks later, and it came with the precision Daniel had taught the Apache to expect. From well-led cavalry, scouts reported the column's approach 2 days before they reached the mountains. 200 cavalry, 50 Apache scouts, and a supply train that suggested they planned to sustain operations for months. Colonel Carrington was not attempting a quick raid. He was mounting a campaign of extermination. Kaya called an emergency council. Every warrior in camp attended, along with the women and elders whose voices carried weight in matters of survival. The debate was fierce. Some argued for retreat deeper into Mexico, where American soldiers couldn't legally follow. Others wanted to scatter into small groups and reunite after the threat passed. A few hotheads demanded they attack the column directly. Damn the odds. Daniel stood and waited for silence. When he spoke, he kept his tone calm and analytical. Scattering makes you vulnerable to the Apache, Scouts Carrington brought. They know how we move, how we think. They'll hunt down small groups, one by one. Retreating to Mexico buys time, but solves nothing. They'll wait and catch you when you return for winter supplies. He paused. Running is not survival. It's just slow death. Then what do you suggest? Kuruk demanded. We make them come to us, on our terms. On the ground, we choose. Over the next hour, Daniel outlined a plan that drew on everything he'd learned from both worlds. The Apache elders contributed knowledge of terrain. The young warriors added insights on mobility. Goyakla suggested modifications based on past battles. By the time they finished, they had something that felt less like a desperate gamble and more like a genuine strategy. But one warrior, the same one who'd questioned Daniel's loyalty weeks earlier, stood and addressed the council in heated Apache. Naira translated, her voice tight. He says this plan is too convenient, too perfect, he says Daniel, is leading us into a trap where we will all be killed. He demands that Daniel be bound and guarded until after the battle to prevent him from signaling the soldiers. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt every eye turn to him. Suspicion warred with trust on faces he'd come to know well. Even some who'd trained with him looked uncertain. Before Daniel could respond, Takoda stood. The boy was 14 now, taller, carrying himself with the bearing of a warrior despite his youth. He spoke in clear Apache, his voice ringing with passion. Naira translated, wondering in her voice. He says that Daniel saved his life when a rattlesnake struck during training sucked the poison from the wound without hesitation. He says Daniel taught him to read, to think, to believe he could survive this war. He says that anyone who doubts Daniel's loyalty is a fool who understands nothing of honor. Goyakla stood next. I have fought beside this man. I have seen him turn away from killing when it would have been easier to shoot. I have watched him train our young with patience our own fathers did not always show. If he is a spy, he is the worst spy ever created, for he has made us stronger, not weaker. Kuruk rose, his scarred face grave. He beat me in combat and could have killed me. Instead, he showed mercy and offered respect. That is not the action of a man planning betrayal. One by one, warriors stood to speak for Daniel. Even some who'd been skeptical added their voices. The tide turned, and the accusing warrior found himself isolated. Kaya ended it. Ashki Nata Ani fights with us. Any man who doubts this can leave now. We do not force loyalty, we earn it and give it freely. She looked at the accuser. Choose. The warrior glared at Daniel, then stalked from the council. He would leave before dawn, headed south. No one tried to stop him. That night, as Daniel and Naira prepared for what might be their last sleep together, she said quietly, You have become one of us. Truly. Not because my mother declared it, but because our people chose it themselves. Some still doubt. There will always be some, even among those born Apache. She moved his hand to her belly, where the child kicked with increasing frequency. But this little warrior knows who you are, and that is what matters. The battle began at dawn 3 days later. In a narrow canyon Daniel had scouted weeks earlier during routine patrols. The cavalry column entered from the south, led by Apache scouts who moved with cautious efficiency. Colonel Carrington rode near the front, a tall man with gray in his beard and eyes that missed nothing. Daniel recognized his type. Professional soldier, experienced, dangerous, precisely because he was competent rather than reckless. Behind the colonel rode someone Daniel hadn't expected to see. Lieutenant Harrison, the young officer whose patrol Daniel had deliberately misled 6 months ago to let the Apache family escape. The act that had cost Daniel his career. Harrison's face was harder now, scarred on one cheek, carrying the look of someone who'd learned war's cruel lessons. He scanned the canyon walls with experienced wariness, hand near his weapon. The column advanced slowly, scouts checking every rock cluster, every shadowed overhang. They knew this was an ambush country. What they didn't know was that the ambush wasn't where they expected. The Apache weren't hiding in the rocks above. Most of the warriors had circled behind the column during the night, moving through terrain the army believed impassable. Only a small force remained ahead. Daniel and 15 warriors, including Goyakla and Takoda. When the column reached the canyon's narrowest point, Daniel raised his hand. The warriors ahead fired a single volley not to kill, but to stop forward progress. Soldiers dove for cover. Horses reared and screamed. In the chaos, the main Apache force struck from behind. It was the San Pedro River ambush. Reversed the tactic Daniel's own people had used to kill Naira's father, now turned against them with devastating precision. The cavalry tried to form defensive positions, but couldn't coordinate in the narrow space. The Apache scouts with them scattered, unwilling to die for army pay. Within minutes, the column was broken into fragments, each fighting desperately without support from the others. Daniel saw Carrington barking orders, trying to restore order through sheer force of will. He saw Harrison rally a group of soldiers into a makeshift defensive square, and he saw the exact moment Harrison's eyes found him across the chaos. Recognition flared, then shock, then fury. "Mercer!" Harrison's voice carried over the gunfire. "You goddamn traitor!" Daniel didn't respond. He was too busy coordinating the warriors' movements. Using hand signals Goyakla had taught him to direct flanking maneuvers. The battle was brutal but brief. The cavalry, realizing they were being slaughtered, began a fighting retreat back down the canyon. Carrington covered the withdrawal with professional efficiency, leaving no wounded behind, maintaining discipline even in defeat. But as the soldiers fled, Harrison broke ranks and charged directly at Daniel. The young lieutenant came like a fury, saber drawn, his face twisted with rage and betrayal. "You sold us out! You sold your own people for these savages!" Daniel sidestepped the saber thrust and brought his rifle butt across Harrison's wrist. The blade clattered to the ground. Harrison tackled him, and they went down hard on the rocky ground, fists flying. "I didn't betray anyone," Daniel gasped, blocking a punch. "I refused to murder farmers. They killed my men. 17 soldiers at that canyon last year. That was the tactic you taught them. They killed soldiers who came to kill them. That's war, not murder." They rolled across the ground, each trying for advantage. Harrison was younger, faster, but Daniel fought with the desperation of a man protecting everything he loved. Finally, Daniel got his forearm across Harrison's throat and pinned him. "Listen to me. This isn't about sides anymore. This is about survival, theirs and mine. I chose where I belong, just like you chose the army." Harrison's eyes burned with hate, but also something else, grief perhaps, or the loss of whatever respect he'd once held for his former scout. "They'll hunt you forever," Harrison rasped. "Carrington won't stop, and neither will I." "Then we'll die free," Daniel said. "Better that than to live as murderers." He released Harrison and stood. The lieutenant grabbed his saber and scrambled backward, expecting to be killed. Daniel lowered his rifle. "Go. Tell Carrington that the ghost band cannot be trapped, that every soldier he sends into these mountains will feed the earth. Tell him we will fight until there's no one left to fight, but we will never surrender." Harrison stared at him, blood running from a split lip. "You're already dead, Mercer. You just don't know it yet." He turned and ran after his retreating unit. Goyakla appeared at Daniel's side. "You should have killed him." "No, he'll carry a message better than any corpse." The warriors regrouped, counting casualties. 3 wounded, none seriously. They'd inflicted heavy damage on the cavalry column, at least 30 dead or wounded, countless horses lost, and a supply train abandoned in the canyon. It was a stunning victory. But as Daniel looked at the retreating army, he knew Harrison was right about one thing: Carrington would not stop. This was only the beginning of a long campaign. The question wasn't whether the army would return. The question was whether the Apache would survive when they did. They returned to camp as heroes. The victory was total weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, even cavalry uniforms that could be used for future raids. The women ululated, the children ran circles around the warriors, and the elders nodded with satisfaction. But Kaya's face was grave when she pulled Daniel aside. "You let him go." The young soldier. "Yes." "Why?" Daniel thought about how to explain. Because mercy sometimes speaks louder than violence. Because that soldier will tell others what happened here, that we fought with honor, that we showed restraint even in victory. Some will hear that and question what they've been told about savages and hostiles. Maybe not many, maybe not enough, but some. Kaya studied him. You still think like a white man sometimes. No, I think like someone who's lived in both worlds. That's different. She smiled faintly. Perhaps we will see if your mercy becomes wisdom or regret. Naira found him at the edge of camp as sunset painted the mountains gold and crimson. She threw her arms around him, her pregnant belly pressed between them, tears streaming down her face. I thought I lost you, she whispered. Never. I promised you we face everything together. She pulled back, enough to look at him. There will be more battles. Yes, the army will not stop now. They will send more soldiers, more campaigns. This victory will make them more determined, not less. I know. Our child will be born into war. Daniel cupped her face in his hands. Our child will be born into a family that fights for what matters, that chooses love over hate, that refuses to surrender even when surrender seems easier. He kissed her forehead. And that child will grow up knowing that their father chose honor over comfort, that their mother is the strongest person in any world, and that their grandmother is a legend who refused to let her people die. Naira pressed her face against his chest. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what comes, no matter what battles we face or how dark things become, you will never regret choosing us, choosing this life. Daniel held her tight, feeling the life growing between them, thinking of all he'd lost and all he'd gained. I promise, he said, and I'll keep promising every day for the rest of my life. They stood like that as night fell and the stars emerged, two people from different worlds who'd found each other in the chaos of war and built something that neither army nor time could destroy. Behind them, the camp settled into evening rhythms. Fires burned bright against the darkness. Children's laughter mixed with the low voices of warriors checking weapons and planning for tomorrow. And somewhere in the distance, an army licked its wounds and planned its return. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, there was love and hope, and the fierce determination to protect what they'd built no matter the cost. 5 years had passed since the canyon battle. The Chiricahua Mountains stood unchanged, eternal sentinels over a land that had seen empires rise and fall. But everything beneath those peaks had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible on that summer day when a desperate matriarch offered a dying scout an unthinkable bargain. Daniel Mercer, known now only as Ashki Natani, the name spoken with respect across 3 territories, stood on the same outcropping where Naira had first taken him years ago. The valley below sprawled with life and purpose. The camp had grown to nearly 200 people. 3 allied bands had merged with Kaya's group, drawn by reputation and results. The wiki-ups stretched in organized clusters, smoke rising from cook fires, children's voices carrying on the morning breeze, corrals held over 100 horses. Gardens planted by the women yielded vegetables that supplemented hunting and raiding. It looked less like a fugitive camp and more like a thriving community. Near the central fire, a girl of 4 winters chased her younger brother through the dust. Rebecca, named for Daniel's sister, had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. The boy, Thomas, named for Daniel's father, toddled after his sister with determination that outweighed his coordination. A 3rd child grew in Naira's belly, due before summer's end. Naira appeared beside Daniel, moving with the practiced balance of a woman long accustomed to pregnancy. At 30, she carried authority that matched her mother's, serving as Kaya's primary advisor and the band's chief negotiator with other Apache groups. "Watching your empire?" she teased, slipping her hand into his. "Our empire," Daniel corrected. "I just helped build it." You taught a generation of warriors to think 3 moves ahead. That is more than helping. It was true. The young men Daniel had trained Takoda, Neol, and dozens of others now led raids with surgical precision. They'd perfected the art of striking hard and vanishing before retaliation could form. The army called them ghosts. The Apache called them hope. More importantly, they'd learned to pass that knowledge forward. Takoda, now 19 and a respected warrior, had taken over much of the training. He taught with the same patient intensity Daniel had shown him, and the cycle continued. Goyakla returns today, Naira said. He brings news from the reservations. Good news or bad? With Goyakla, it is always both. The warrior arrived at midday with a small delegation. His face bore new scars, but his eyes held the same sharp intelligence. He embraced Daniel like a brother before speaking with Kaya in her wiki-up. When the council convened that evening, Goyakla's report painted a complex picture. The wars are ending, he said through Naira's translation. Not because we are defeated, but because both sides are exhausted. The army cannot catch us. We cannot defeat their numbers. It is a stalemate dressed as policy. He described reservation conditions still harsh, still diseased, but slowly improving as Eastern reformers demanded change. Some Apache leaders were negotiating terms. Others, like the famous Geronimo, continued fighting with fierce defiance. What does this mean for us? Kuruk asked. Goyakla's answer was pragmatic. It means choices. We can continue as we are free but hunted, strong but small, or we can negotiate from strength, trade our freedom for safety and influence on the reservation, help shape how our people survive the future. The debate stretched long into the night. Daniel said little, understanding this was not his decision to make. But when Kaya asked his perspective, he spoke carefully. 5 years ago I was hunted and dying. You gave me purpose and family. Together, we built something that proves Apache people can adapt without surrendering who they are. He looked around the circle. Whatever you choose, that truth remains. You've shown that strength isn't about refusing change, it's about controlling how change happens. Kaya nodded slowly. Wise words. We will consider them. The decision took months to reach, but eventually Kaya made her choice. The band would remain in the mountains for now, but would begin building relationships with reservation leaders. Young men like Takoda would serve as messengers, carrying tactical knowledge and cultural wisdom to those trapped behind agency walls. It was a long game, preparing for a future where Apache survival meant political influence rather than military resistance. We do not surrender, Kaya explained to the assembled band. We evolve. Just as Ashki Nata'ani evolved from soldier to warrior, we evolve from warriors to something new. Something that lasts. On the night after her announcement, Daniel sat with Naira and their children around their family fire. Rebecca insisted on a story, as she did every evening. Thomas climbed into Daniel's lap, thumb in mouth, already drowsy. Tell us about the horse, Rebecca demanded. This was her favorite, the story of how her grandmother had offered her father an impossible choice, and how that choice had changed everything. Daniel glanced at Naira, who smiled and nodded. Once upon a time, he began. There was a warrior woman who needed to save her people. She had lost many loved ones to war, and knew that if nothing changed, she would lose everyone. So when a stranger came to her camp, a man with no home and no tribe, she saw something others missed. What did she see? Rebecca asked, though she knew the answer. She saw that sometimes the strongest choice is the hardest one, that bringing together 2 different worlds might create something stronger than either world alone. Thomas yawned hugely. Rebecca leaned against her mother's side. And did it work? Rebecca whispered, fighting sleep. Daniel looked at his daughter, his son, his wife with her pregnant belly, and the thriving camp beyond their fire. He thought of Takoda, leading warriors with wisdom beyond his years. Kaya's legend grows with each passing season. of the future taking root in children born of two peoples, carrying the best of both. Yes, he said softly, it worked. Rebecca's eyes drifted closed. Thomas was already asleep. Naira rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, her hand on her belly where new life stirred. No regrets, she murmured. Daniel thought back to that day in the desert, thirsty, discharged, certain he would die alone and unmourned. He thought of everything that had come after. The fear, the challenges, the battles, the love, the children, the belonging. Not a single one, he whispered back. Above them, stars wheeled through infinite darkness. Somewhere in the valley, a warrior practiced the tactics that would keep his people alive another day. Children slept safely, dreaming of stories their parents told. And a community built on impossible choices thrived against all odds. The army would come again, challenges would continue. The future remained uncertain. But in that moment, by that fire, with his family safe and his purpose clear, Daniel Mercer understood something profound. Worth isn't measured by the life you're given, but by what you build from the ashes of what you've lost. He had been bought for $500, the price on his head, when the army branded him traitor. But he had gained something priceless, a family, a people, and proof that honor matters more than comfort, that love can grow in the harshest soil, and that choosing the right path, no matter how difficult, is its own reward. As the fire burned low and his family slept around him, Daniel closed his eyes and felt, for perhaps the first time in his life, completely at peace. The warrior who led the young had fulfilled his purpose, and the children he helped raise would carry that legacy forward into whatever future awaited them, strong, adaptable, and unbroken. The story that began with desperation had become one of hope, and hope, as it turned out, was the strongest weapon of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.